Okay, let's start. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining LexisNexis and our partners for this seminar or this webinar. My name is Santish Deval. I'm an academic consultant at LexisNexis and very pleased to be facilitating today's session on teaching ethics for accounting professionals. And speaking of accounting professionals, I'd like to take this opportunity to just quickly congratulate everyone at all the institutions who had students writing the ITCs. Congratulations on all your results. I know a lot of blood, sweat, and tears go into that. But on to today's business. With the world in the shape that it is, and the slew of ethical scandals and debacles that we've been seeing, you as lecturers are expected by the governing bodies of your professions and by society to make a positive difference in the caliber of professionals that you deliver to the market. Not only when it comes to their technical competency, but also to their behavior and their decision-making processes. And that is not an easy task. We all know that, and that's why we're here. To help us navigate what all of this means to academics in South Africa, we're very pleased to welcome some of our authors on our publication called Ethics for Accounting Professionals, a Case Study Approach, which is a collection of uniquely South African case studies. I want to introduce you to our panelists, and I'll introduce them in the order that they're going to speak. First up will be Katua Plant. Katua is an associate professor in the Department of Auditing at the University of Pretoria. She's a certified internal auditor and holds a PhD in internal auditing. She's also the ethics champion for the Accounting Sciences program at UP. Second up will be Lorraine Erica Derbyshire. She's the senior lecturer at the Northwest University School of Accounting Sciences, holds a PhD in accountancy, and is a registered CA. Following Erica will be Mojalefa or Jeff Mosala. Jeff is a senior lecturer in financial accounting at the University of the Witwatersrand School of Accountancy. He's a registered CA and obtained a Bachelor of Accounting Honours from the University of the Free State. Jeff was one of the finalists in the prestigious 2020 SAICA Top 35 Under 35 competition. And lastly, we'll be joined by Faiza Jaffa. Faiza is a senior lecturer at the University of South Africa in the Department of Financial Accounting. She's a registered CA and obtained an MPhil in Accounting Sciences cum laude from UNISA. Her dissertation entitled Auditor's Assessment of a Company's Tone at the Top. This master's of hers won the award for the Best Research Masters of 2019 in her field. And last but not least, she's not going to speak, but I wanted to mention her as well, not only because she played a key role in the creation of our book, but also because she plays a key role in the broader ethics landscape when it comes to the training of accounting or accountants. Ilse Libbe, she's an associate professor and the head of the College of Accounting at the University of Cape Town. Ilse holds a PhD in higher education studies and is a registered CA. She's also the leader of the Ethics Collaboration Research Group. Welcome, everyone. We look forward to hearing your expert advice this afternoon. To our audience, we're going to try and keep this session interactive. You won't be able to speak, but please put your questions in the Q&A tab. Use the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen. We'll track those questions and we'll address as many of those as we can. We ask that you reserve the chat box for general comments and not questions that you'd specifically want our speakers to respond to. We hope that we don't miss any of your questions. There will also be a poll at the end of the session, which will be at 5 o'clock, with 4 easy questions for you to answer. We won't ask too many and too difficult questions of you. So we'd like to get your input on that, please, and we'll talk about that some more later. Let's kick off. Katua, can you start us off by setting the scene and defining ethics for us, please?
Thank you, Santisha, and thank you, LexisNexis, for this opportunity this afternoon to share some ideas with you colleagues on the teaching of ethics and using specifically our textbook, Ethics for Accounting Professionals, a case study approach as point of departure. So I'm going to start with the ethics vocabulary that we discuss in the textbook in chapters 1 and 2, just some highlights. And then I'm going to hand over to Erika, who's going to discuss case study 13. Jeff will discuss case study 11. And Fahisa will discuss case study 2. And the colleagues will also touch on the teaching of ethics and their experiences on the topic. And then I will just conclude. So if we can start with the first introduction to ethics, it's important that we explain to students what ethics is. So if we look at the definition of ethics, in chapter 1, we use the definition by Dion Rousseau, which says ethics is about thinking and doing what is good, fair, and just towards the self and to others. We can move to the next slide. So if we look at the triangle, it's about thinking and doing what is good, fair, and just towards the self and the others. And it's a balancing act between the self and the others. So it's not unethical to be self-interested, but it's definitely unethical to be selfish. So we start with the definition in chapter 1. So it's very, very important to explain to students what ethics is. And we like this definition by Dion Rousseau. Then it's also important to explain to students that there are different spheres of ethics. There are 3 spheres of ethics. One's personal ethics, business ethics, and professional ethics. If we start with personal ethics, on the next slide, we will see that personal ethics is your own ethical commitments, your behavior towards others. So it's important you are not on an island all on your own. You are interacting with other humans. So it's your behavior and attitude, your character, when you are interacting with others. So it's very important to explain to students their personal ethics, then to show them the business ethics sphere, which is behavior during economic activity. It's those principles, norms, and standards that an organization aspire to. And it enhances the interests of the others. So who are the others? The other stakeholders. So here the self is the organization and the others are the other stakeholders. So it's very important to explain that there's a business ethics sphere as well. And if we look at the next slide, this is a nice example to explain to students that ethics is the wiring of the governance umbrella. If we look at an organization, every organization must be protected by an effective governance and ethics umbrella. I always tell the students that the governance is the panels of the umbrella. Governance have various structures and systems and processes in place. But if the wiring of the umbrella is not working, the umbrella is going to collapse and the organization will be prone to risks such as fraud and corruption and mismanagement. So the wiring of the umbrella is the ethical culture that must be built, and that is business ethics. It's building an ethical organizational culture as part of the governance outcomes also prescribed by King IV. And then finally, the professional ethics sphere, where we focus on the standards adopted by professionals, the moral behavior of the members, And students need to understand that it's to the benefit of society. So your code of conduct is the agreement that you basically have with society so that they can rely on our opinion and that they know that they can trust our opinion and that there's credibility to the services that we render. Now, the question that we usually pose to students on the next slide is we ask the students, are we wearing 3 different hats? Do you at home now wear your personal ethics hat? When you get into the car and you drive to the office, you put on your business ethics hat. And then when you grab your audit hat and your green pen, you wear your professional ethics hat. And then we use a practical real life example, like the Boeing example. Boeing company CEO was headhunted because of his good personal ethics. And they wanted him to instill his good personal ethics into the business. So they headhunted him, and 2 years after his appointment, there was a directors meeting. And on the agenda was Mr. CEO, married to Mrs. So-and-so, has an affair with fellow director, Mrs. So-and-so, married to Mr. So-and-so. Ethical dilemma. What should we do? Boeing company had to take a decision. Should they ask him nicely to leave? Or is it a personal matter, a private matter? It's got nothing to do with the business. The business is doing well. The business is generating profits. So we're going to ask him to stay. It's got nothing to do with the business. So what did Boeing company do? So then we go into a debate with the students and we ask the students to decide and give their opinions and to try and motivate their opinions. And then I come with the answer to say Boeing company actually asked the CEO to leave because they said if he can be dishonest to his wife, he can also be dishonest in the workplace. So there's not always a clear-cut line between your personal ethics, your business ethics, and your professional ethics. Then the next important issue is for students to recognize ethical dilemmas or ethics issues. And what helps is if you can tell them that, ask yourself, was some law or regulation or company policy or company rule violated? If the answer to the question is yes, the chances are very good that it's an unethical business practice. The second question that you can ask is, does the balance between the self and the other sway towards the self? If the answer is yes, the indication is that there might be an unethical business practice or an ethics issue. The third question that one can ask is, could this action or this decision harm other stakeholders? Like the Boeing CEO having an affair. He was supposed to ask the question, will my decision to have an affair harm the stakeholders? What will the perception be out there if it's on the front page of the Sunday newspaper? Do people use words like unfair? We have to be careful here. Shouldn't we get legal advice on this one? You can make this decision, but I don't want my name attached. Nice girls or guys come second. When in Rome, do like the Romans. Do you feel uncomfortable about something and why? All of these are indications that you are busy with an ethics issue. So it's very important for students, firstly, to be able to identify an ethics issue. And that's why we have the different case studies in the textbook. Students must then identify the ethics issues in these case studies. Next slide. So how do we solve then the ethical dilemmas? We use various ethical decision-making tools. And the most popular one would be our code of professional conduct. So whether you're a SAICA or a member or a SAIPA or an ACCA or CIMA member or IIA member, you use the code of professional conduct. But there are other tools also available. And I'm going to discuss with you the PLUS tool, but there are other tools as well. So the PLUS tool starts with the first question, asking the question, is some or other company policy violated? So the Boeing CEO asked the question, is the company policy violated? And the answer is no, because nowhere in the company policy will you see that having affairs is prohibited. So then you go to the second question, is some or other law violated? And the Boeing CEO again said no, there's no law violated. But then he gets to the third question, can we make having affairs a universally accepted practice? If the answer to that question is no, we cannot make it a universally accepted practice, you must stop immediately, because the chances are very good that it's unethical business practice. And then the last question you ask in the plus tool is the self-test, which I've alluded to, namely asking yourself, if you have to read this on the front page of the Sunday newspaper, if you have to disclose your action or your decision, how will that make you feel? Will you still feel comfortable with the decision? So the plus tool is just a general tool that one can use, but the challenge we sit with, what if the code does not provide the answers? Then we sit with a real ethical dilemma or a gray area, because the options between right and wrong are not very clear. Then we have to use the ethical decision-making tools. And our case studies facilitate this process for students to ask the question, number one, what are the ethics issues? Number two, who are the stakeholders that are affected by the ethics issue or the ethics issues? Then students must ask themselves, what are the consequences of the unethical behavior to the various stakeholders? And then finally, they must come up with a recommendation of what is the right, fair, and just behavior or action. Colleagues, that is my story. So I'm going to hand over to Erica to share with you a few ideas around the pedagogy around teaching ethics, and then discuss case study 13. Thank you, Erica.
Thanks so much, Kato. So I'm very excited to do this. Yes, but I'm going to start off with what Kato just said, what our case studies are about. We really delve into those gray areas where there's no clear-cut answer, there's no clear response that we can get from a king governance type of assessment of the issue or a code of professional ethics, and that's something unique about our case studies. So the first question that we need to ask is, what is the objectives of ethics education? So one of the things I think you might be thinking about or debating in your mind is, are we trying to make students ethical people, or do we want any one of our target audience to become ethical? Now, the response to that is no. That should not or is not the objective of ethics education, because if you look at my next slide, the ethical frameworks of individuals are impacted by so many things. That includes businesses as well, corporations. There's the worldviews, the values. Katua spoke about culture. She also spoke about society value systems. There's the law that has the impact on our ethical frameworks. And because every one of us had different experiences in our lives, and all the businesses that we have out there have different ways of doing things, the ethical frameworks are not the same. So we cannot expect that we want our students to become ethical people. So what are we trying to achieve? We really want in our ethics education to get students to think about their behavior and their actions, as well as the actions and behavior of others. So that's the first thing we want to do. Then we also want them to deeply reflect on their own decisions and behavior and the impact it has on other people, as Katua said, or other stakeholders. Then they need to identify where they need to delve into their own character to then get new habits, because you cannot change your character after 21 years of being on this planet. Your character is what it is. But once you realize that there's a characteristic you possess that doesn't have necessarily good outcomes for other people, we can develop new habits. So that's also one of the things that we want to get students to be cognizant of. Then the other thing is to instill courage. Courage for our students to do the right thing when no one is looking, when they get into the business world. But then the other more difficult task is to get them to have courage to speak up and do the right thing when they do identify that there's an issue within their corporation, because we are training ethical leaders. This is what we're trying to do here. So against the backdrop, the IFAC code introductory statement, it's also the introductory statement to the South African Institute of Chartered Accountants. Code of Professional Conduct says a distinguishing mark of the accountancy profession is its acceptance of responsibility to act in the public interest. And I think it's important that we make our students aware of this. When they enter into the studies to become a professional accountant, doesn't matter what type of professional accountant they want to be, they need to acknowledge the fact that when they enter, they need to accept that responsibility, that they will need to act in the public interest. And that's why we said they need to develop courage if they don't have. So one of the leading accountancy professional bodies, new competency framework, actually shows how ethics really covers everything. One of my colleagues once said it's like the sugar on Smarties. Not Smarties, the jelly tots. It's everywhere. It's messy. You sometimes don't know what to do with it. Do you eat it? Do you throw it back in the packet? Do you throw it in the dustbin? What do you do with it? But it covers everything. And it won't be a jelly tot without that sugar. So it won't be the same. So how do we teach it then? So I will go to the next slide. There's many ways in which we can teach ethics, but if we are trying to get to the same common goal, and I like this ethical reason decision-making acumen that the South African Institute of Chartered Accountants have now defined for us, because we now have a clearer picture of what do we all want to achieve in terms of ethics education for accounting professionals. And they really stipulate that we want our students to apply ethical reasoning, critically reflect on their own belief system and ethics system, as well as that of others, then delve into the impact that their own decisions and actions has on others. Couture referred to the others as stakeholders. Then against that, they need to understand why we need to make ethical decisions or why we need to alter our behavior. Why there's a need for that. This ethical reasoning process helps us then to resolve what Couture referred to as these moral dilemmas. There's no code or framework that can help us solve it. But once we have this deep understanding of what we are dealing with, we are one step closer to resolving it. If you can look at my next slide, there's many ways in which we can achieve this ethics training. One of them is obviously when we role model to our students what ethical behavior looks like, when we take them on initiatives, these corporate citizenship initiatives, when we involve them in practices where they give back to the community, give back to society, give back to other students, we give them a feel. But that's not always possible. One of the most effective ways that I found in teaching ethics is that we can use case studies that simulate real-life examples, where we bring the context of all the disciplines that our students will find themselves in: taxation, accountancy, auditing. We bring it into a real-life scenario. And in this scenario, they can use these frameworks that we teach them to first identify viewpoints, the reasoning behind actions or behavior that they identify in a question, the impact that these decisions and actions have on stakeholders, and then for them to assess whether it's morally sound. Couture gave us a checklist that could be used in assessing whether the decision or action is morally sound, but the most important thing, we need to resolve it. So what would be the way forward? These case studies can be used in class debates, class discussions. We can have role play where students act out the issues that they see in the case studies. You can also use it for summative assessments, where we have a whole bigger assignment for a semester where they can use this one case study and they resolve an issue that we present to them. We can ask students to make student presentations or videos with regards to issues that they've identified and how their teams, for example, interpreted the issue at hand. And I want to draw you to, for example, case study 13 in our textbook. And the next slide, the plastic bravura one. So the backdrop of this case study is related to corporate citizenship and corporate social responsibility. So this case study starts off by introducing the company Plastic Bravura. That's one of the big manufacturing companies of plastic materials, packaging materials in South Africa, and they are situated, their plant is situated in a city called Kramerston. They have 5 distribution centers. Then there's a news online article that simulates real life that states that 5 children have died as a result of contracting a rare disease. Then this news article also states that the doctors that was actually interviewed cited the fact that these children got these rare lung diseases because they inhaled large quantities of plastic material. They are also located in the same area as Plastic Bravura's manufacturing plant. And then later on, this online article also states, an insider said that during a specific month in a year, Plastic Bravura was testing out new air filtration systems, and one of them had a fault. And they only noticed it 9 days later, so they didn't actually knew that there was poisonous air or plastic dust that was released. And then there was the issue that there were activists actually coming after this company saying they demand for this company to take responsibility for what has happened. Then there was this board meeting that was called by the CEO. In that board meeting, the CEO actually denied that the company had any involvement in the deaths of those children. And you could clearly see in the scenario, there's a reason that the CEO had that view. The business is not doing too well. There's been international sanctions against the use of plastics, and the company cannot afford another scandal or something like this, because they could pretty much close their doors. So the CEO doesn't want to take responsibility. But then the CFO has a different viewpoint and says, but listen, we need to resolve this. Then one of the suggestions that were made actually was, let's issue an integrated report where we highlight all the good things that the business is doing for society, for the economy, we're paying tax. But then the CFO actually identified the fact that, what about the fact we're still not resolving the issue that we are blamed for these children that had died? So we don't tell our students in this scenario that what the ethical issue is or the moral dilemma. The beauty about these case studies is we need to go into a deep discussion, or the students need to go into a deep reflection of what is the ethical issue that we have at hand. What are the viewpoints? There's this one viewpoint that we shouldn't take responsibility, and you can clearly see there's reasoning behind that. And then there's the CFO that says, but we need to take responsibility. So our students need to deeply reflect on these viewpoints and what the implications of going with either of these two decisions would have on the stakeholders. We don't take responsibility, or we do. There's going to be consequences no matter what. So we don't delve into that initially. But then the case study evolves into, so that the students can clearly see, but listen, these decisions didn't happen overnight. There's something deeper in this business that made the company do a decision like this, testing air filtration systems without warning the public that they didn't verify that these are actually safe for use, so that the public can take precautionary measures, didn't consult anyone. So there's where a policy comes in for CSR, and you can clearly see that this business doesn't regard the immediate society as being one of the key stakeholders of the business. So the students need to see that's the first problem. Our company strategy doesn't consider our immediate society as a stakeholder. That's a problem. Then it evolves into discussions of why do we need to take into account various stakeholders when we make important decisions like the ones we did make. Because the truth is, we ignored society, and the cost for that, the reputational damage, could be irreversible. Even worse if this company does not take responsibility. It then evolves into the corporate governance concerns that we see that the board of directors have failed in their mission in terms of leading this company in an effective and ethical way as prescribed in Principle 1 of King. Also, the board of directors do not want to take responsibility and accountability for what had happened. There was also the fairness issue surrounding the CSR practices that never took into account society. It then further evolves into students now need to consider the impact that all of this had on the stakeholders. And then lastly, these case studies actually show How are we going to resolve this? What's the way forward? We now understand what had happened, and then there's a bigger problem. There's a cultural problem. There's the fact that our strategy has issues, our CSR strategies have issues. So it's not just a matter of addressing the fact that we've caused the deaths of these 5 children. There's a deeper problem. So what is the way forward? Coming up with those type of solutions. But you'll also see these case studies don't have definite solutions. It's written in such a way that there's more solutions, creative solutions that our students can come up. But it's important for them to think about the actions and the behaviors of the board of directors and the company and what it had on the stakeholders. Then it was important for them to consider the fact that this had an impact on society, and it also had an impact on the business. It was not morally sound. But then after that, we need to come up with solutions. And these case studies facilitates this, and we can use a wide variety of ways in which we can present it to the students. As I said, we can have class discussions, debates, we can give them assignments, summative assignments, we can get them to do role play. And yeah, these are beautiful case studies that students can actually relate with, where they see themselves as professional accountants in the future. I'm going to hand over to Jeff now.
Thank you so much, Erica, and good afternoon, colleagues. And so I'll be presenting on the case study 11, which deals with the Power to Us. It's an electricity utility company from the textbook, and I'll be talking on facilitating ethics for a diverse group of students. So just to deal with those 2 issues in my presentation. Now, in the next slide, I will be giving you background to start with a case study in the textbook of the issues that this case study tries to deal with. And I summarize these characteristics into just 4 main parts. The first one being the ethical dilemmas. Secondly, the personal, professional, business ethics and the citizenship element that this case study brings forward. And then the third area is to just demonstrate the area of strategy and risk and the impact that it could have on a business. And the last part of the background I try to sum up would be the role of leadership in a case study scenario. So firstly, this case study presents, just on the previous slide, yes, just on the first part, on the area of dilemma, this case study presents an ethical dilemma which has possibly more than one issue or more than 2 issues that could create a conflict. So it's about a fictional utility company, and I think it is relevant within the South African context and perhaps globally as a result of the whole load shedding, and because we're in a desperate need for a solution at the moment. And I think it creates an exciting relevancy for anyone who is facilitating these ethics sessions. And globally, with the war in Ukraine, this has affected the European countries' energy options, and some of these European countries who are at an advanced stage in terms of their energy mix have now resorted to coal in order to supplement their energy needs. The second part under this whole dilemma issue is this has led to the issue of sustainability. In South Africa, we are still grappling with the whole energy mix. Do we stick with coal, which has a lot of, we have a lot of in this country, or do we build new power stations that are much more, have other energy options, or do we refurbish these old ones to keep old towns that are sustained by these power stations? Because our problem is desperate at the moment, and it has affected the economy enormously. We have inflation, we have low economic growth, it has affected jobs, so on and so forth. So this is becoming quite desperate in the country, and the following might not have been part of the case study. However, I thought it would be relevant if you're using this textbook or would consider using these case studies, is to consider I mean, recently we've had the Disaster Management Act on energy, but it was revoked on the 5th of April due to a court application. And the idea apparently with this act was to help fast track the development of new independent power producers and the registration process, or cut any red tape issues that are delaying the energy expansion programs. And another thing that could come from this case study, because it's a utility electricity company from the case study, relevant to us in South Africa, is the PFMA exemption application, which the Treasury had, which implies that the company would be able to avoid reporting on irregular and fruitless expenditure in their financial statements, but may report in their integrated reporting, and auditors would then not flag these issues. And the idea is because we want to cover the covenants which might be triggered if these things are flagged in the auditor's report. However, this brings in the issue of ethics. You see, using reporting to avoid communicating some of these state-owned PFMA requirements by legally exempting it. Would it be a matter of prioritizing the rating on the utility company, which means we can then be able to still afford the loans, which we desperately need to keep those covenants? And what about the South African government or the taxpayers who might not be able to afford the situation if it goes out of hand? And then the last bit under this whole dilemma issue is, at the moment, this exemption is suspended, and there are further discussions, obviously, to try and maybe legitimize the process. So that is the first part that we start considering under this case study. Now, the second area is the personal, professional, business ethics and citizenship. Personal and professional values of individuals that are working in such a condition for a state-owned enterprise may be conflicted. And I think then, what are their options? What could there be a conflict on their values or with that of the business values at the moment, what the business is trying to achieve? You consider the coal issue, which might be a solution to solve the load shedding problem, but has a negative impact on the environment versus other energy sources, and the possible effect of the planned sustainability reporting standard that is coming in the future. That is just an additional consideration. And in terms of the professional ethics, as an accountant, your commitment to the whole, full, transparent reporting versus the exemption reporting in the integrated reporting for the sake of maintaining the life of this company and perhaps also the life of this country from a fiscus point of view. This creates a possible conflict between your professional expectations and that of the business as well. And the third area, still dealing with this possible conflict in terms of the moral, ethical values. This could be setting a possible precedence to say, in order to avoid certain issues, we just find legal ways of justifying why companies not doing well by legalizing it through the exemption, and therefore we try to minimize the impact on stakeholders. And the question would be, what would be the impact in the future? Do we do this to avoid real issues within our companies? And then just on the other bit is, for business ethics, what would be the impact on the various stakeholders? What is the impact or in terms of the preference of the coal versus other sources, and the full reporting versus the exemption in the long run on sustainability, and in particular the environment and the going concern? And then from a strategy and risk point of view, it is just to show you that a company's strategic views and risk management perceptions could have certain ethical considerations. And just lastly on this slide, the role of leadership, to say the case study shows how, just on the last slide, I'm still on the last slide on the role of leadership, to say the case study shows how leaders and future leaders' requirement to have a challenge in complying with the King Code and they may be conflicted by various stakeholder expectations. And the question is, whose stakeholder should you prioritize as a leader or as a future leader? As some stakeholders will definitely have to be compromised, and there remains this personal values and business ethics conflict versus stakeholder expectations, and the challenge of trying to balance all of this. And the last bit on this is what ethical theory or reasoning lenses to apply in choosing the preferred option or strategic option as a leader, and just for one to be aware of these reasoning lenses. And then if we move on to the next slide, as part of the process of trying to come up with the solution, these are possible considerations and discussion points I think one would try to get from the student's perspective, to say the King Code expects that leaders, ethical leaders, must be able to anticipate and prevent or reduce negative consequences or entity activities on society and the environment and the resources that are being used. That's number one. And therefore, as a leader, you should be able to manage these expectations or be, and as you can see in the case study, you would see that based on the case study background, there are possible conflicts in terms of expectations, in terms of goals, values by the different stakeholders. And then this case study also gives an opportunity for students to think about section 6.6 of the King Code, which deals with specific state-owned entities and how the governance process of that should be. So that would be the first one from the top. The second consideration from the top is then the stakeholder management theory. A student would need to identify all stakeholders, as my colleagues have mentioned, that would be affected by an entity or its decisions, particularly also in this case study. And they should also be able to realize that there's limited guidance, there are limitations on the order of priority, which is subjective and usually compromises one or the other stakeholders. And then the third consideration would be from a business versus personal ethics conflict that we discussed earlier on. A student would start to pick up, should be able to pick up that it's not easy to decide what should be prioritized. That's the first area. And secondly, you learn to identify the list of these expectations and conflicting issues, which you should be able to match from a professional point of view and from a business point of view in the case study. Then the third area, the fourth area from the top would be the ethical reasoning lenses or the theory. This is part of seeking the solution, the course of action. A student should be able to identify possible theories that we use to justify, to reason ethical activities or decisions so that they align it to their strategic options. However, they should be able to appreciate the limitations that come with each of those scenarios in this case study. For instance, the application of utilitarian theory, what are the pros and cons in relation to this case study, the deontological theory, stakeholder management theory, or the virtuous principles, and how would they be limited in one way or the other, and appreciating those limitations as well. And the last area on this slide that I wanted to discuss that a student could possibly pick up is the idea of public interest. Usually very easy to identify. However, in this case study, you realize that it is not as simple because the idea of public interest is so broad in this context, because you've got a general South African public, you've got investors, you've got the government, you've got employees, you've got unions, you've got international or public citizens, because we are part of the global world and we cannot ignore that. And the question is, in whose interest are we going to work in as a leader in that area or of a company like that? And then the last bit of point is, as a professional, for example, as an accountant, you are accountable to your professional body. As a member who has your responsibility solely on reporting, on transparency, and applying or making sure that you're in line with the professional code of conduct, versus being a leader of a state-owned entity which has the responsibility to the public, which is still broad, but you have responsibility to delivering the business objectives, which in this example I've mentioned the coal versus maybe green energy, and secondly the idea of full transparency reporting versus limiting it and finding legal ways to eliminate exposing some issues that would uncover them, some covenants. And some professional bodies, for instance, have expressed their idea on this to say we want full transparency, and that could create a bit of conflict with the idea of thinking. In the next slide, I'll be just touching a bit on what I think my two colleagues have touched on, which would be the diversity of students and their experience towards the study of ethics cases. I think the idea is that in South Africa, one of the biggest issues that we have is large class sizes and how they magnify the issues we have in class. We've got, you're going to have a large including a diverse qualities or characteristics of our students. And these include the different backgrounds and exposures from the different walks of life. We have different experiences and what our students have been exposed to. And therefore it might, and it will definitely affect their views, their perceptions, and their reasoning perspectives. And secondly, there are different learning styles, how they take in information and how they share information or express themselves. And that leads to the next part of language or communication barriers, which are some of the diverse issues we have. And then the knowledge levels, we've got different with different exposures, and therefore how much they know will differ. And the last bit would be their beliefs and values, which affect how they see the world and how they reason to find what is ethical, what is moral according to their perspective. However, in the next slide, while we acknowledge these differences, we also appreciate that we might not be able to teach students to be ethical. However, we can facilitate their process of thinking, reasoning, and processing information. And a Harvard psychologist, Kohlberg, found that when a person's ability to deal with issues can develop, and education can affect this development. So in addition, a person's ability to deal with moral issues is not all formed at once, which gives, I think, me comfort as a facilitator to say, as there are stages in physical development, the ability to think morally also develops in stages. And then through these deliberate educational attempts, we can influence awareness of the problems and influence the reasoning or judgment process that our students can apply, and it has been shown to be effective in the past. And so we are able to, through these programs or educational attempts, we are able to sort of bring these diverse group of students to the center, to closer to each other in how we reason through ethics, through the ethics education. So the idea is we bring each other closer to a common ballpark understanding and processing of information, a rational way of reasoning why something is ethical and why something is not. So the challenge of that diversity, we are able to narrow it down through these approaches. So in my last slide, I tried to sum up some of the tools that have assisted in facilitating the ethics using these case studies. My colleagues have mentioned some of them, and I might be repeating some of it. Firstly, I think it is very important to include some form of critical thinking. This helps to develop this fundamental skill of thinking, to be able to identify issues, to be able to reason in a rational manner, so that you train that process. Even though they come from diverse backgrounds, you are able to shape and give them tools to process information. And then secondly, having an interactive class culture. I think one of the important benefits of having a discussion or an open discussion class is that you get to hear how students are thinking, you get to understand their limitations and perhaps inappropriate reasoning processes, and be able to measure their critical thinking skills and perhaps have interactive measures to try and improve that. And then the third area would be group learning. I found this to be very important, creating multiple assessments in a session, in a class, or in a course that force them to work in groups. Because I feel as they discuss topics or they discuss a question, and to get different perspectives, they can maximize on those benefits. Different perspectives is not always negative, and there are benefits from hearing how other people think about the same issue. And then the third area, which I found to be very important, my colleagues touch on this, is the idea of the role playing of case studies. I think that's the best way to bring to life these case studies, which are real stories or fictional, but have a lot of similarities to what we are seeing out there. And to do that, students are able to find ways that are I would say, informed ways of expressing ethical views, and they find themselves in a position where they get to experience these cases in a different way, even though they might not have been exposed to similar scenarios in real life. And then last but not least, to conclude on some of these tools, I think the idea of having news and current affairs discussions just helps to bring it all together, to make students realize that ethics is happening. It will be with us for a long time. It has been happening, and that they become better related to these case studies because they're based on similar stories that are happening every day. We wake up every day with a different case study, a new situation. And I found that the feedback from students was that the ethics module was much more real to them. They could relate to it. It's not airy-fairy, something that feels like it's too far from where you are. And I think these are some of the, not an exhaustive list, but some of the things I could try to highlight. And that's where I will end. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff, and to the rest of the panelists. I will be brief with my session today. The agenda on my session is to discuss actually it's chapter 3 and case study 1 of the textbook, and also I will bring my experience when I designed the curriculum for decision making. The case study 1 basically is about a company in the property industry. It follows the same, if you want to call it, format or a template that the other case studies did that Jeff and Erika had discussed. So we will look at the ethical dilemmas that our students or rather the company faces. We will look at what are the consequences for those ethical dilemmas that have been identified, and who are the stakeholders involved, etc. So with this company specifically, it's a JSE listed company. We have a CFO that is new to his role, and he has identified that the CEO has overridden controls and has not taken the due diligence tests that were necessary for the company to undertake. So that amounted to non-compliance of laws and regulations. Like with every ethical dilemma that is in that case study, in these case studies, we have to consider the different hats that the person has to wear when they are facing this ethical dilemma. So they will look at the personal ethics, that is in their personal capacity, how does it affect their values? They will look at the business ethics, if they are a director of the company, which this person is, the CFO or the financial director. They should consider how is the company affected. So it could be from a reputational point of view. It could also be from in their point of view, their fiduciary duty towards the company. So and also what will be the effect on stakeholders if this comes to light. And last but not least, they would also have to look at their professional, themselves as a professional. If they are, for example, in our case, the CASA, then they would have to look at how does that affect them professionally if it comes to the light that they were involved in such an ethical dilemma, and how they actually manage. What Couture had said that when you are out there, we have to teach each of these 3 hats, and it's important that they take into account these consequences. More so that now we are in a world where everything is digital and virtual, so it's easier for people to pick up on these dilemmas. So that's the whole idea around case study 3. It is at a basic and to intermediate level, because with these case studies, we try to position it where they are where students at a more beginning stage of learning ethical decision making can answer it, to those that are at a more advanced level in their understanding of ethics and how to make decisions surrounding it. So basically that is what the chapter is about. I'm then going to take you into my the next slide, into my understanding of ethics when it comes to the development of ethics in a curriculum. This is a very profound sentence that I found, and that I think is very important to us as lecturers. Teaching ethical reasoning is not about teaching what one should do in particular circumstances. It is about teaching students how wisely to make very difficult decisions
involving ethical considerations where the answers are anything but clear-cut. Students need actively to discuss problems, possible solutions, and the advantages and disadvantages of these potential solutions. Then they have to decide how they would act. So it's very much what we've been saying all along, that ethics is not just about the knowledge of ethics, it's also about applying that knowledge to to different dilemmas which may not have the right answer. So this is the starting point in how we develop our curriculum. So the next slide, I will just give you some tips and recommendations about how I went about including decision-making curriculum. Like the others, I found case studies are a good resource to look at when discussing ethical decision-making, because there's no right or wrong. It's bringing people's different values into account. It's looking at how the people think differently. But obviously, there's also an answer that we will tend to lean towards based on theories and the experiences and past consequences of similar situations that we take into account. What has been more challenging for me compared to my colleagues on the panel is that I've been having to bring this more in an online environment. So it's a bit more challenging than if you had to do it face-to-face, and actually foster discussion amongst the students. So it has to be through fostering case studies, but getting students to debate within groups and to collaborate. So it is making use in our environment of teaching assistants or e-tutors to assist us in getting that discussion going. And obviously, the more bigger the group, the more difficult it is to control the engagement. So we need to make sure that these engagements take place in a comprehensive manner. So the other thing when it comes to ethical decision-making, you'll see, like Jeff had said before, is that the decision-making mimics and encourages critical thinking. And the pathway that we follow to make ethical decisions really mirrors the way we think critically. It's great because it then teaches our students to think outside the box, so to speak. And it allows them to come to an opinion themselves. It also enhances them ties that as they go into the work environment, they can be facing any different sector. It does not necessarily mean that they will be in a manufacturing industry or they'll be in auditing. They will have to think about the factors that impact that industry. So like with chapter 3, that the due diligence that was not undertaken affects the property industry and is a contravention of the FIC, the Financial Intelligence Act. Now, that is something they don't necessarily do at university, but it is something that they need to think about, that when I go out there, I need to know the industry that I'm working with. I need to be proactive. I've learned at university, and that makes all the difference. When it comes to decision making, problem solving, and really critical thinking, it's Bloom's taxonomy that I found is a good framework that assisted me in developing my curriculum. So even though this is more specific to critical thinking, ethical decision making, I find, is not that different from this. So the next slide, you will see a framework of Bloom's taxonomy. I think most of us are familiar with it and the revised taxonomy. What's nice is when you develop your ethical curriculum to follow up is to say, our students need to first understand ethics. They need to understand where is it coming from. They need to understand how their culture plays a role in their decision making. They need to understand that when they are in business, there's a business ethical culture, and that their personal ethical culture does not necessarily equate to the business ethical culture. So that is one such thing. Yes, they may have similar values, but they need to understand also that they are professional, and professional behavior is different from your personal behavior. So sometimes it might not be so obvious to some of our students, but so we need to express it to them. So that's where the more bottom levels of Bloom's taxonomy will fall in, and how we build it into our ethical course. So we make them understand ethics. We will then ask them to apply the different codes or frameworks to the dilemmas that they are facing. So for example, when it comes to personal ethics, we will discuss more the theories behind it. When it comes to business ethics, we will bring to light the Companies Act and the King 4 that will discuss how ethics affects of the business, and it also brings into account to them as a director in their personal capacity, their duty to the company. And then last but not least, also, we will ask them to apply the code of ethics so that them as a professional can understand how does it affect them in their professional capacity. But then it comes to them, taking them to the more advanced level and saying, okay, these are, you've been able to answer the questions before and apply your knowledge by saying, okay, this is a direct contravention of King, or that's direct contravention of the code of ethics. But in practice, it's not so clear cut. In practice, what you will have is are facing. And that's the thing about these case studies, is that they are real life scenarios that are mimicked. So people can understand that what there is what you're going to face in real life. And there's no lecturer to hold your hand and say, this is the way you're supposed to go. There's no one there that is going to tell you that this is the correct decision. It's for you to take what you have learned and translate it to practice, to get advice from legal, for example, to get advice from those above you, below you, and understand what exactly you are facing. And that's where the evaluation, analysis, and the creative solutions come through. And that is what we see in Bloom's taxonomy. And last but not least, what I would like to introduce to you in my experience, or bring forward in my experience, is that when developing curriculum, you realize that you've got to research a whole lot of things. And on my next slide, you will say, okay, it's fair enough that we have these Bloom's taxonomy levels. How do I translate that into knowledge? By one study that was completed in school, so they talk about freshman, sophomore, junior levels. But if we translate that to our scenario in South Africa, we would say that we're going to take it from NQF level 5 right up to NQF level 8. And then obviously we then see how to apply the knowledge and skills that they are learning. But the nice thing about it is that whatever you've learned from before, you're building on as you're going on. So it's building blocks for your students, and it's not something that they see right at the end. Another thing about the ethics is that it should not only be something that is taught on its own. It's something that we feel should be integrated with other subjects. So yes, it's nice. Each subject should bring it a little bit of it into their curriculum, so that students can see that something that is done does have an ethical implication as well. So if I'm overstating my bad debts, for example, that has an ethical implication. And then we can bring real life scenarios about how those things have actually brought companies down or collapsing because of it. So for me, that's basically the tips and the recommendations and experience I can share when it comes to curriculum development in respect of ethics. And the fact that when it comes to case studies, we have tried to design them in a manner that can support students right from the beginning till the end. But I hope you did find this interesting, and that the tips and recommendations will assist. And just to end off, when it comes to ethical decision making, just something that I would like to alert lecturers to explore is that when it comes to decision making, we should actually really try and use more rubrics for assessment rather than a marking plan. With us as lecturers, we tend to use marking plans because it makes marking easier, and it also gives students a better guideline. But that really doesn't test whether the student has actually understood or has been able to master the skills of decision making. So that is one such recommendation that I would make to lecturers. And last but not least, I would like to end off to say that as lecturers, and we ourselves are always learning every day. We can never be an expert in all the fields. And when you try to incorporate something into your curriculum, or you're trying to develop something, I always think the best way is to look at what other people have done and learn from them. So it's to research your work, research the ideas and the way things are being done, not only within your own field, but also outside. And I found that to be really valuable in developing my course, especially since it's online and something that hasn't been explored before. It is a real challenge to try and get it across to students when you're not actually engaging with them directly. So by all means, whatever my colleagues have said, that all works and is extremely valuable in teaching ethics. But just translating that to different environments can be a bit of a challenge, but that is a discussion for another day. So thank you, colleagues, for your time and for giving me the opportunity to discuss my experience with you. And I hope you have enjoyed and perhaps picked up a point or two about translating ethics into your curriculum. Appreciate that. Katua will just take over for the Q&A session and for some closing remarks.
Thank you very much, Faiza. Colleagues, just a few concluding remarks from my side. The first one is, I'm sure that you've noticed that we focus on the three spheres: the personal ethics, the business ethics, and the professional ethics. And in the case studies, we have ethics issues relating to all three spheres. So this is quite in line with SAICA's new CA 2025 curriculum, but also the ACCA and CIMA curricula, where they focus more on not only the typical professional ethics type question that we used to, but they're now bringing in more business ethics, real life scenarios in these qualifying exams. And it's very important that our students are ready to answer these questions. The second thing I want to highlight is that what Faiza mentioned, marking with a rubric. So you will see that our case studies don't have specific suggested solutions because we want you to mark it with a rubric. You can very easily, and we've done it as well, I have experience of asking the students to identify the ethics issues in this case study. If they can't identify it, they get 0. If they can only identify a limited number of ethics issues, they get a 1, 2, or 3. And so you progress with the rubrics. The second thing, you want to be able to identify the stakeholders who are involved or are affected by the ethics issue. That can easily be marked by a rubric. You want them to explain the consequences to the stakeholders. These are the typical questions also asked in the professional examinations. And it works wonderfully to mark these with a rubric where you can assess the students' critical reasoning skills. The second concluding remark is we also allude in chapter 1 of the textbook to the apples and barrels analogy, where we say that we all are different apples, but we are put into the same barrel, the same organization, and we cannot say anything goes. We cannot say we are all from different backgrounds, different upbringings, different religious groups. We have to come to a common understanding of what we see as ethical within our organization, within our society, within our profession. So we have to get that message across to our students that we are talking about ethics and having ethics dialogue to come to a common understanding of what the right thing is to do, and that rational interaction that Jeff also alluded to. And then my final remark is what Erica mentioned, is that we cannot necessarily teach people to be more ethical, but I firmly believe we can definitely help our students to make better ethical decisions. And this textbook facilitates this process of helping our students, even if they are good students, to make better ethical decisions, because good people also sometimes toe the line. And that is my concluding remarks. I'm going to look at the Q&As. Will the slides be shared? That's the first question. I think LexisNexis will share the slides. Amanda, welcome. She also asked, will the recording be made available? I believe so. I don't know if Cynthia wants to answer that. And
Hello.
Simon, yes, Cynthia.
Sorry, Katua. Yes, the recording will be made available at a little bit of a later stage, and yeah, we'll get it to the people who are here, and we'll also try and put it up somewhere. But we'll tell you where to find it.
Okay. And then Asanda is asking whether the rubrics are also included in the textbook. It's not included. We are more than willing to provide a template rubrics and send that to LexisNexis to distribute or to put on the portal or whatever. We are busy developing additional educational resources that lecturers can use together with the textbook. Are there any other questions?
One thing, sorry, if I can jump in here from the sidelines. All of what you're talking about, and yeah, it would take students out of their comfort zone. They're very comfortable with getting the answers in being given to them, but here they have to go and look for the answers. How do you encourage them to do that? How do you physically go about doing that? If you're sitting, I'm thinking, Faiza mentioned that she has to try and do it online and it's easier in a classroom. Are people comfortable with speaking up in a classroom these days? I know when I studied, if a question was asked, it was met with complete silence.
Yeah, so you are 100% correct. So we take them out of their comfort zone. So it's very, very important, the skill of the facilitator. So the facilitator has to really now facilitate a lively discussion on ethics and not only dump information. This is really a live discussion with different viewpoints, different scenarios, really a lively debate. So it's really up to the facilitator to facilitate this lively discussion in the class and make this case study come to life, and listen to all the viewpoints and keep a neutral viewpoint as the facilitator.
I also assume that prior preparation for class becomes quite important.
Yes.
Because paging through the book, I can see that you really take a student through the whole process. There are these specific the different questions and the different areas that you have to consider are demarcated. Erica, there you also have your hand up to say something.
Yes. So what I normally do to see whether we got the message through, that's where I said we can use the summative assignments. That's typically where we don't use a typical solution like you would do for your technical modules. Like Atua said in phase, I said we use rubrics. So we put them in a scenario in the case study context. We give them a few things to consider, and then they need to submit an assignment for us to assess, to just see whether the message got across, especially if the engagement wasn't as expected within class. But we need to somehow determine whether the message got across. And I think that's where, again, case studies with incorporated into summative assignments could really be helpful.
Okay, great, yes. And speaking of summative assignments, what I always remember about being taught ethics was at the beginning, you start and you have certain viewpoints. And at the end, once you've been through the course, you realize that I was completely out of line in the beginning. So do you do you make people revisit then their first sort of attempt at answering a question? Is that something that you've done?
I will talk from my experience, and it's actually something that Ilse facilitated. Initially, we had the values scorecard challenge that we did, and we normally adapt that a little bit from my side. We have that questionnaire or sort of setting that we put the students in to see what the response looked like. And then again, at the end of the semester, it's not for us to actually assess it for marks, but it's, as you said, for the students to get an understanding of whether they've evolved in terms of their ethical reasoning, ethical decision making, whether their values have changed since they took the course, whether they're thinking differently about things, whether they would now do something differently against the backdrop now that they know, or have a deeper understanding of why people make decisions the way they do, why people behave the way they do, why is there a need for ethical decisions, what is the implications on stakeholders, and then revisit. Okay, so would I still do the same thing as I said initially? So we do that. It's again one of the things in which we can see whether we've had an impact to get students to think about their actions without necessarily awarding any marks for it.
Thanks very much. Thank you, Katua, Erica, Faiza, and Jeff, for your insights. I'm sure everybody would be able to take something away from this session to go and apply in their courses. We really appreciate your insights. To our attendees, on screen you will see the poll with some questions that we'd really like to get your input on, please. You can follow the link in the chat. Is the link in the chat? Just want to make sure that you can answer these for us. If the technical team can just let us know where to go. But otherwise, we have.
Santish, we had one more question from Professor Singleton that needed to be answered. If we could quickly do that. Professor Singleton wants to know, how do we get our academics themselves to come out of their comfort zones and upskill themselves to integrate ethical dilemmas and facilitate discussions in their respective subject modules? I can hand over, before handing over back to Katua, I just want to say, I was one such academic that had to upskill myself, and I realized that we as academics, we have to know our material to be able to transfer it to the students. So it's like being a sales rep. If you don't know your product, you can't sell it. So it's also, firstly from ourselves, we've got to take initiative. But secondly, from a university's point of view, what I found very helpful is we have these weekly or rather monthly discussions or chats online, normally for research, but we've now recommended that it be done for tuition purposes as well. So as academics, we come together and we showcase different things on how we bring different elements into our modules. So that could be one way. Another one is perhaps to have a guest lecturer come in, or have them do a specific topic or preparation before a chat, and then come in and then apply it to their modules and give them the opportunity to engage and ask questions. I think most of our lecturers are afraid, not from a lack of knowledge, but rather they don't have the experience to translate ethics into their courses. So if we can also just heat up the discussions within our own environments, that would really play a significant role in upskilling our academics. Thank you.
Amanda, if I can come in there, also at our institution, we hosted an ethics workshop that was an entire day where we upskilled our staff. Like Faiza said, we need to be on the same page on what we are going to be teaching in these different technical modules and how we are going to get the message across. So we had workshops, and we are evolving in terms of the content that we teach the lecturers. We have a common set of slides, for example, that we have on PGDS PFMA, and all the other lecturers get that. We have trained them in that, and then they can design ethics type of cases and questions in their tests related to that. And then we also have upskilling workshops coming up.
Anyone with Katua, did you want to add to that?
No, nothing to add, Santish.
Okay, good. Thanks, everyone. Then we've come to the end of our session. Yeah, we hope to see more of these interactions. Oh, sorry, Ilse, you've got your hand up.
Thanks, Santish. And yes, I said I won't talk, but I couldn't help myself. So thank you very much for setting this up, and to my colleagues and co-authors that presented. Thank you so much. And we were actually, guys, before the session, we were just talking amongst ourselves how the variety of the different case studies in the textbook, and I'm so proud that it's actually been written by so many colleagues at different institutions. You can see we've only covered 3 case studies here, but there's actually, if I look at the book, if I quickly have a look now again, there's a long list, 18 chapters, of which 16 of them are actually case studies in different scenarios with different viewpoints, different voices in South Africa, very much within our context. And this is an open invitation. Santish said earlier, there's colleagues in taxation that's interested in case studies. Please, I want to invite you. Maybe we can work together as colleagues and create more case studies and share that amongst ourselves. I think the wonderful part for me is that this is also a community in which we can share these case studies instead of having to develop your own case studies all the time. So it's an invitation to everybody to say, if you feel you would want to join us and we can do another set of case studies, please do not hesitate to contact myself or Santish or any of our presenters here. So thank you very much for this. All right.
Thanks, Ilse. I notice now in the Q&A session, there's a new question. Rhodes Dera, I'm not sure that I'm pronouncing your name correctly, is asking Jeff, please can you briefly explain the issue of ethics reporting and PFMA in relation to Eskom or the utility firm in your case study? So that's a nice integration question for you there.
Yes. So this was initially not part of the case study. Obviously, the issue that we're currently facing that's happening now with the exemption that was applied for, and it's currently, I think, temporarily halted. I thought it was important to bring it into this discussion just to demonstrate how relevant these issues can be. So what is currently happening with the PFMA requirements from a reporting perspective for a state-owned entity, institution like Eskom, they need to have additional disclosures on expenditure that are classified by the PFMA as irregular expenditure and fruitless or wasteful expenditure. And some of the considerations that auditors, external auditors, would need to look out for would be some of those things which need to be flagged in their audit reporting. So, however, there's a legal way. It's legal. This exemption can be applied for by management of Eskom. And the issue they had is it is fruitless and wasteful expenditure in terms of what the PFMA requirements are. However, in terms of the IFRS, which Eskom is they use as the reporting framework, they wouldn't become much of an issue. And the issue is that because the auditors will bring them up as a result of it being in line with the PFMA, it might trigger some of the loan covenants that Eskom has with its borrowers, which might trigger those immediate demand payments and put, obviously the fiscus under pressure, because currently the state is funding that. So that's the first issue. So now, in order to legally bypass this whole thing, the Treasury, the minister, can exempt a state-owned enterprise from disclosing these issues. From an IFRS perspective, it doesn't cause any issue. However, from a transparency issue, as a state-owned company, it creates this bit of conflict where most professional bodies are arguing as well to say we want full transparency. Yes, we understand where you are coming from, but we think that this is now suggesting or gives the wrong impression to investors or even to borrowers or even to the public at large to say if something is being, they are trying to hide it. And secondly, the other issue is the reporting will still be done of fruitless and wasteful expenditure in the integrated reporting. So I was just bringing it as an interesting issue to say there's possibly this conflicting issues from an accounting perspective in terms of IFRS. It would have been okay. However, because it's a state-owned entity and these expectations, additional requirements that might affect the rating of Eskom and what the effect could be for us as a country. I mean, I'm thinking utilitarian theory here, if I were to consider that to reason my way out of it. So I was just trying to bring it to create a discussion. It was not included in the case study, but I think it remains relevant.
Yeah, and a perfect example of how as a lecturer, you can bring extra stuff to the case study. So you can ask basically this exact same case study as a question, but you in a test or in a summative assessment, but you can just add a little twist of your own and add a curveball. Very nice. Thanks, everyone. Jeff, Faiza, Erica, Katua, and Ilse, thank you for being with us today. I think we are now really at the end of our session. We look forward to engaging with you more on this topic. My email address is on screen, but I have colleagues in the other parts of the country. I'm based in the Western Cape, so you're welcome to contact any of us. We simply refer your question to the authors, but I'm sure you all know one another anyway and can track one another down. So yeah, let's keep talking about this. The webinar recording will be made available. It will probably be put on our academic portal fairly soon, but we will also let you know. And yes, thanks to everyone who joined us from all different parts of the country and even some from Namibia. It was good to have you, and stay safe and well. Thanks.